Welcome to the Pilates Business Podcast, where you will find out about how you can benefit from the creation of Pilates business development and marketing assets. Now, here's your host and Pilates business founder, David Gunther.
Welcome, Pilates business owners, Pilates instructors, and friends. Today we're speaking with a very special guest, Bruce Hildebrand. Bruce is an instructor, a Pilates instructor for over 15 years. He'll correct me on exactly the number of years, I'm sure, and has in the past had 3 studios all at the one time, so he's a good juggler. And now he still has a Pilates studio, but he's come up with a solution to a very important problem for our industry. That's one of the reasons that I'd like to speak to Bruce. Welcome, Bruce, to the Pilates Business Podcast.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me along.
That's a pleasure, Bruce. Look, we're going to start way back when you got into Pilates. What actually got you into Pilates, Bruce?
Early days for me was a hugely athletic childhood. I played every sport under the sun. It wasn't until many years later that I really learnt that I was a kinesthetic learner. So really my modality to understand things was to really move through them. And so that took me down a very athletic journey. So from Australian rules football to tennis to athletics and baseball and a range of different team sports and so forth. I have early recollections of mindfulness exercises before they were called mindfulness exercises. Literally probably just a coping strategy from one of our school teachers, I remember in probably early as grade 4 or grade 5, laying us on the grass and just letting us listen to the surroundings. So that was one of my earliest memories of being aware of the inner world inside of our bodies and also the outer world around us. And yeah, lots of inspiration from seeing sports people in action and really aspiring to essentially be involved in some degree to the industry. I didn't necessarily see myself being an elite sports person. I had a decent crack at playing top level Aussie rules football and state level in Victoria and also WA, but really it was more my interest in how the human body functions, and that took me to a sports science degree and then down the Pilates path.
Excellent. We have some things in common then, Bruce, because I'm a lover of sport and movement, played Aussie rules, and my highest achievement there was the under-13s playing on Manuka Oval, which has very wide wings. And during that game, we played against the Farah League, and these boys rocked up from Victoria, the Farah League under-13s, in their cars with their girlfriends and their smokes. Put them out and then ran onto the field and smashed us. The connection then between sport and then Pilates, when did that happen? You did your degree in sports science. What happened then?
I would just want to come back to your story there, David. I think many of the listeners have probably got a similar background, whether it be in some form of movement or some form of exercise that Pilates then speaks to at some point in time or to some degree. The magic for me is Pilates starts to open this new trapdoor into what's possible with the human body. So the breakthrough for me was I took a summer break after first year university and I was tossed a triathlon magazine by my then boss, who was a keen triathlete, as I worked at the local swimming pool in Alice Springs for my summer break. And he said, you might be interested to read the article inside of there. So I flipped to the Pilates article that he pointed out. And it was an article written by a wonderful lady out of Canberra, in fact, where you're based, of course, called Sandra Laffenberger. And she was one of the earliest, in my understanding, people involved with Pilates in Australia.
Bruce, I've got to interrupt you there because this is an incredible coincidence, but Sandra Laffenberger is one of our clients in Canberra, has been for the last 10 years or so. And when she did come to us as a client, we were very happy because we knew of her reputation, particularly as a psychologist and with working with pain management through Pilates and psychology. So what a coincidence that you would mention that you came to Pilates through the same person who is now participating in Pilates in Canberra still at our Pilates Cairns studio. Wow. I'll have to get permission from Sandra to mention this on the podcast, so it might be cut out, but hopefully Sandra will be thinking it's a good thing. The other thing I'm going to say there is I'm sure she's going to be quite chuffed that she actually inspired your journey and what you've done with Pilates and where you're going with it now. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation that I'm going to have with Sandra, and that might be another podcast episode, actually, just thinking about it. Yeah, sorry to interrupt there. You go ahead, Bruce.
There's lots of full circles, and I've got another one to share in the next little part of the story. But it was Sandra who, look, I see it as part of each of our contributions as we, I think, commit to an industry to the degree that we choose to, as to how much we essentially give back. And a big part of that for me is being able to find a way for Pilates to reach more and more people. I think it can be misconstrued in many ways in the current climate. But the more we can do to have the opportunity to experience Pilates, then I think that's a great thing.
Yes, it certainly is. And that's very much the case with Pilates business as well. We see opportunities for our industry to grow and do all that much more with what it has already done. Tell me the next step for you. So you were inspired by Sandra and you actually then took up Pilates in some way?
I actually followed up with the phone number that Sandra left on the bottom of the article. That was the summer of 96, so it was a fair way back now. Some of our listeners may not even have been born at that point, as they say. Sandra had a colleague in Melbourne, one of my absolute early inspirations, Jocelyn Dexter, who many people perhaps neither have heard of, but Jocelyn is an outstanding contributor to the Pilates industry, including the dance world as well. And Jocelyn was also one of the earliest participants, in my understanding, of Pilates in Australia. And Jocelyn was involved in the Box Hill TAFE dance program. And so I was able to track her down and spent the first term of my second year of university skipping the Monday morning lectures to attend the dancers' Pilates classes on a Monday morning. Initially, it was I think a 10-week kind of program where the dancers were given an opportunity to participate in Pilates, which I think is fantastic and continues widely to this day. But Jocelyn was kind enough to have me come along and simply observe the sessions. And it wasn't until week 7 or week 8, if I recall, Jocelyn said, "All right then, you sat there and watched for long enough. Time for you to join in." And I picked my jaw up off the ground and I said, I can't do anything along the lines of what these dancers are able to do. But she insisted, and so I took up a mat and joined in. I think I was wearing my Aussie Rules football shorts at the time, a bit of a faux pas in Pilates in general. But I participated, and I distinctly recount having absolutely no idea of the instructions that Jocelyn was providing, and had zero ability to connect with my body in the way that Pilates does so well. But what it did certainly is open the trapdoor to the magic that is Pilates as I've known it for many years since.
Very good. And so were you inspired by your own lack of brilliance at Pilates? Is that what happened?
Well, I was terrible. And I love something that, like the thing for me, David, it made complete sense. Theoretically, like it was biomechanically sound. We just spent the previous year at university in the cadaver lab studying anatomy, and I was really inspired and keenly interested in that. Biomechanics also was one of my favourite subjects, on the back of physics being my favourite subject at high school. And so it was pretty obvious, and perhaps even destiny, that I was going to be led down the path of understanding the human body from a biomechanical and movement perspective deeper. And I think Pilates is the perfect playground for that. As that term of classes finished, the opportunity to participate dropped away, and I distinctly remember having Jocelyn's business card on my pinboard for the remainder of my university time for the next couple of years, promising myself that I would attend it, but I actually never got around to it. Her studio was at the Victorian College of the Arts, helping lots of dancers there. So what ended up happening was it fell by the wayside a little bit, David, until I got to the UK in 1999. And I had an opportunity to participate in the teacher training program over there, and essentially immersed myself for the best part of 4 years in learning in some incredibly beautiful studios with amazing and really richly experienced teachers, some people who'd been teaching at the Pilates for 15 years even at that point in the late 90s. So yeah, it was an unbelievable opportunity for me to essentially be immersed in that learning setting. And yeah, my experience opportunities continue to grow from there.
And Bruce, experiences like that with really top instructors that have been themselves immersed in that sort of face-to-face practical education. That's terribly valuable and terribly rich. Do you have any stories about that time that you spent in Britain?
Oh, there's many a story, David, perhaps a few that should be left untold, but we might bring them out one day. To complete the story around Sandra Laufenberger was Jocelyn Dexter, who I mentioned, who was my first touch point with Pilates, eventually ended up coming on for a short period and working with our team in Balance and Control Pilates studio that we had many years later. So that was fascinating and actually a real privilege to have Jocelyn come on the team at the time. The times in the UK, David, that was very much an inspiring time for me. I had some incredible mentors, which I acknowledge every time I teach, more often than not. Helga Fisher was amazing. Helga's background was as a dancer, a massage therapist, an Alexander technique teacher, and a fantastic Pilates teacher who very much I warmed to because of her amazing kinesthetic sense when it comes to teaching Pilates. Judy Herbert was amazing. Gordon Thompson was amazing. Lynn Robertson and her husband Lee ran an amazing organisation in body control Pilates in the UK, which I've got a hell of a lot to thank them for in the support. And Miranda Bass and Catherine Wilkes and Rachel Wilson and a couple of Aussie names in there who spent some time in the UK. Some very inspiring people that I was around daily, and it was inspirational to be in that sort of learning environment.
I've got a question. I'm curious, Bruce, about the common values between those people. Could you identify things that were in common between those names that you just mentioned that are really inherent with that sort of quality Pilates instructor?
I think the standout for me, David, is that they all just absolutely had a commitment to their clients. There was a genuine care and a genuine consideration for how they could work with their clients in a way that helped their client get the most out of the session. And this is the bit where Pilates, I think, transcends so many layers of us as people, because taught by a great practitioner, Pilates can really cut through and impact us on so many levels that it's really often difficult to describe. Yes, we do a stretch here, and yes, we do a strengthening exercise here, and clients still complain that their abs hurt the next day and they felt great after Pilates. And the more that you participate and the more that you explore and the more that you take a deep dive, I'm crystal clear that Joseph Pilates was a genius in the way that he was able to synthesize so many layers of information and put them together. And I think it just speaks volumes of the man that he was, and that his objectives in getting people to understand how important it is to use your physicality so well and so deeply, and to be very aware and very connected on so many levels. I think that's why Pilates still exists today and still carries on and still helps many infinite numbers of people get the most out of their body on a daily basis.
So, Bruce, you spent a number of good years in the UK and learnt a lot, and then you came back to Australia. Was that your next port of call, back to Oz, or was there somewhere else in between?
There was an important segue from my time specifically in London, where I originally learnt to teach Pilates. An opportunity came up with a colleague another fellow I'd studied with, Kennard, who now works out of Malta in Italy, southern Italy, I should say. He had a good mate who I had met a handful of times based in Edinburgh. And so Ben Brown was a fellow up in Edinburgh who'd seen the opportunity to come down to London and study Pilates. So he'd done the basic mat work training. And he was quite keen to open a Pilates studio in Edinburgh, one of the first up there. So I spent 8 months of 2003 in Edinburgh with this amazing opportunity to essentially open a studio with Ben. We went from the ground up, and essentially I did a carbon copy of everything I'd ever learnt in London in the way that the studio needed to run, from equipment and operations to finances and everything, in a way that really helped me to understand what it took to open a Pilates studio. And essentially that was the first step for me to wrap my head around what does a Pilates business need to look like, and what boxes does an operation need to tick to really make it come together and ultimately deliver great quality Pilates to the clients.
And what did you find out through that, Bruce, in terms of how difficult it was or how easy it was? Pretty easy, I guess.
Some key takeaways from that time, David, was that it's a huge undertaking to do on your own. So one of my strongest recommendations is to really find a great partner in what you do. It helps to share the workload. It helps to have someone in the same headspace as you on the same level that you can genuinely bounce ideas off. Ben was very much that from a business perspective. However, I felt myself not having a Pilates here at the same level during my time in Edinburgh. So then I sought out a fantastic teacher who also ran a studio locally, a guy called Chris Blagden, who was an ex-dancer from the Scottish National Ballet. And I learned a hell of a lot from Chris as well. So yeah, look, David, I look back very fondly from the age of 22 to 27, my time in the UK. It was an incredibly formative time for me and set me up amazingly for the rest of my life in a way that really embedded for me what's so important about Pilates and also set me on the path of running a Pilates business.
Bruce, that partnership element that you speak about, I believe that is incredibly valuable. And I know that it has been made easier for myself and my wife and partner, Claire, by having two very different people in the roles that we play with our business. And so tell me a bit how that progressed for you when you did come back to Australia and you took on the lessons that you'd learned in Pilates, in business, and that partnering. What was the step that led you to open a studio in Australia?
Well, I was very fortunate, David, to have a colleague who was back in London. We'd spent a bunch of time together when I was in London. Megan Steers. Megan's an amazing physiotherapist. She's originally a Kiwi, so there was a fun expat, Southern Hemisphere conversation going on like there often was with other Antipodeans. Megan and I saw things very similarly in the Pilates realm. It was very amazing to have that camaraderie, and the way that we approached clients was very aligned. So I took a leap of faith and approached Megan and said, I'm considering moving back to Melbourne. I knew that I was ready to open a business from my experience in Edinburgh. And I knew that I didn't want to do that in the UK because obviously I knew it would take some time to establish and develop. And I didn't plan on being in the UK for that extended period of time. So my plan was to be back in Melbourne. I approached Megan. She discussed her end of the UK time was potentially coming as well. So I put it to her and said, what does it look like to open a business together in Melbourne? Her initial response was, you crazy? And that was a fairly common theme through the 10 years, actually, that we owned the business together and ran it and developed that in Melbourne. I've got a hell of a lot to thank Megan for, and that was the partnership that really was the launching pad and the long-term 10 years, like I say, with running Balance and Control Pilates back in Melbourne from 2004.
So that Balance and Control studio, that was your first studio in Melbourne. Whereabouts was that, Bruce?
Yep, so we opened in Richmond. We took the lease on early 2004 and then opened after a few months of a fit out and equipment arriving and so forth. So that was in Richmond. It was in our plans to have a number of studios and also ideally develop some teacher training and so forth. And we managed to do most of those things through those 10 years that we worked together. We expanded to a second studio in Paran in 2009 and then subsequently expanded that same location in Paran in 2014 and acquired a third studio in Carlton, end of 2014. So mid-2010s was a expansion time, and also paved the way for the growth of the business in a way that I was dead keen to proceed with, but it also made it clear that Megan and I weren't keen on developing the same business growth strategies. And so it was in 2014 that we had some tough conversations. As you could imagine, any time you're in business with someone for 10 years, it's never an easy extrication of all the assets and all the things that we had built together. But it was 2014 that we went our separate ways from there.
Okay, so what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to take a big tangent, Bruce, in your story, because since then you've come up with some solutions to a problem. We're going to go back in a future episode and we're going to look at that time that you spent with your 3 studios, because I think that's a whole separate story and a story that I'd like to delve into a little bit more with you and get the details, because that story of growth, that story of partnership, that story of having staff and all of the responsibilities of not just one studio, but in your case, 3 studios. So what we have established is that you've got a terrific pedigree in Pilates and in business. You're also working on the executive of the Pilates Alliance of Australasia. So that qualifies you to help with industry issues. And we do have issues in the Pilates industry. I'll let you explain how you came to understand this particular problem within the industry. And then from there, what you think is going to be a solution, or partly a solution for some people for that particular industry problem. Go ahead and illuminate us there, Bruce.
I think that's a good tangent, I think, David, because the in-between period, there's a lot in it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of learnings. And I think bringing those learnings forward, and often describe it as really the mashup of the learnings, both positive and negative, of course, that we all ride the bumps and so forth of life and business. The mashup really, David, is this new model that I am crystal clear that needs to be created for quality Pilates to continue to be taught around the world. The wash-up, or the simplicity of it, David, is that running a Pilates studio is a fickle business. We're dealing with the loveliest clients, people, and our schedule largely relies on both the ability for us to line up our schedule with our clients at an appropriate time in an appropriate space. And that's a lot of things to bring together. I often describe it as the process is incredibly resource heavy. And so with that resource heavy factor, the profitability of this transaction gets very thin by the end. So this was confirmed by me relatively recently in the 2019 IBIS World Report, which is a market analysis, high-level consultancy report of industry-wide kind of performance and behavior. That report brought back the figure that Pilates and yoga studio, so it grouped those two together, are no more than 7.8% profitable on gross revenue. And when I read that article on this side of running those multiple studios like you talk about in Melbourne, that was actually a very accurate number from my reckoning. Because, and the harsh thing to stomach is that, unfortunately, because of the nature of what we do, it is such a thin profit margin that it actually makes it really difficult to maintain as sustainable.
So we've got this issue of profitability in the industry, and the way you're describing it, it's due to the amount of work that we have to do to bring all of those three resources together: the instructor, the qualified instructor, the experienced instructor, the instructor that can get the job done, the studio location, and that particular client that needs Pilates and will benefit so very much from the right sort of Pilates. So you identified the issue, and how had you tried to solve that in the past? By growing?
Well, that's what I tried to do. I had pressed on. I thought, there's got to be a way, David. There's got to be a way.
Yeah.
And in many ways, as much as anything, I was actually just really interested in, was it possible? I was really keen to push the envelope to see if this model could actually work. And to put a bit of a spoiler, I'm very clear that it's a really tight game.
Yeah.
Really tight. And I'm all for everyone having a crack at that. And I'm fortunate to be on this side of having had a solid pursuit of that. And it's tough. There aren't many margins to make there. And like as instructors, we're with our clients, we're very present, and you obviously put the troubles aside. But really, when you put your business hat on, in my experience, in the Pilates game, it's really thin. And I remember saying very clearly early days, the hat that I wore when I was inside the four walls of my administrative office was very different to what I wore outside of those four walls within the studio space. Essentially, I got to as close as I felt comfortable with breaking point, David, with building the business. And I ultimately knew that there had to be a different way. And through a hell of a lot of soul searching and a hell of a lot of reading and a lot of exploration and a lot of mentoring, I've been given some amazing advice over the years that it's really made a massive difference to now push through what was something that I didn't want to let go of. I wanted to keep it the same way. I wanted to make it work, but really something needed to change. That is what we're now developing, is an exciting new model.
Very good. So you've identified the problem and you've identified the wrong answer or answers and the wrong way of going about it. through persistence and through lots of effort and lots of sweat and toil and money and heartache and tears, which if you've been in the role of a Pilates business owner, you will have experienced all of those things. Otherwise, perhaps you haven't been there for more than a day or so. So, Bruce, tell us about this solution that you've come up with and give us a bit of an overview of what that's about and how that works.
It started, David, with really getting crystal clear on this thing called value. In a nutshell, value for me was defined by the difference between something that was nice to have and something that was a must-have. So it was often described as if you need your vitamins or your health pills from the health shop, then you might swing by and pick them up after work tomorrow or later in the week when it's convenient. But if you've got a headache, then you absolutely need to go to the chemist right away and get some solution to your problem. For me, that's what I aspire to for the rest of my career, is to bring that information forward where it's urgent, that Pilates instructors and Pilates studio owners really are urgent about this resource called time, because it's constantly spilling out the door. And it's nice to say, oh, it doesn't matter, my client didn't turn up, or it doesn't matter, I didn't get that class filled. But it's a bit like an airline who's going to take the flight. If they don't get maximum bums on seats, then that's their profitability down the drain. And it's the same with Pilates time. And it's the same in many industries, of course, that are time-based and service-based. You really have to capture the use of your time, because that is equal to revenue when people come in and pay for their class. But on the other side of that, obviously in the profit and loss statement, is you got to manage the expenses that come with that time. So let's give it an hour to use space for X amount of time costs money, obviously for the overheads from the landlord, the rent and so forth, or if you own the business, whether you're paying that back or whatever it might be. So there is a cost associated with that. And obviously other utilities like putting the lights on when you walk in the door and these costs. So there is a cost literally for every hour, and there needs to be an associated income for that hour. And those are all value things, David. What must be captured, in my really clear opinion, and you can probably hear the passion in my voice about it, we must capture that. And we must really turn it into two critical things. The value is happening in two places. One, between the instructor and the client, and the relationship that they hold. And the other is another value transaction, a separate one, but it's equally as important, is the instructor needs a physical space to work from. They can't teach on the street. They can't teach at the local park. The nature of Pilates, it needs to be in some sort of physical space. So what we did the hard yards on, David, is really distill that down to it being very clear that those two value transactions are happening, one between the instructor and the client and the relationship and the strength of that relationship, and secondly, the importance of that instructor having a great studio to work from.
So what I'm hearing, Bruce, if I can paraphrase or get an understanding around this from a studio owner's point of view, it's about maximising the use of the capacity of the studio space and the time that it could be expected that clients would be available to use the studio, so that you can spread the costs of having that studio across many hours rather than the limited number of hours that it may be able to be spread, because you haven't had a tight enough relationship with the instructor, the client, and the studio. So your solution proposes to bring all three together in a very tight, efficient relationship, so that you can maximize the use of capacity and therefore maximize the efficiency of those transactions and maximize the profitability for the studio, the profitability for the instructor, and the profitability in terms of the quality of the experience for the cost for the client. Is that fair to say?
Yep, that's a great way to wrap it together.
Okay, so what is this thing? What is it?
I think it's probably worth having a close look at the experience I took away, David, from the many, many long hours of modelling the performance of our team of instructors. Because we had X amount of space with a great studio that we had in Richmond, in Melbourne, as we talked about. And I was always doing the calculations about how do we best maximise the teachers, how do we line up the teachers, how do we employ the teachers, etc. And contrasting that in the best case scenario or the worst case scenario about how the calculations worked. Now, I distinctly remember there was a number somewhere along the lines of best use of our space. We could have taken away up around the $2.3 or $2.4 million of revenue in any given year. But the most we ever reached was a 1.05 or something like that $1 million mark in one calendar year in 2016. So at full tilt, that's less than 50% of our potential earnings. And so like I talk about these inefficiencies, it's just a real killer. What we've created, David, is a solution where we've removed the risk of this loss of time. And I know that sounds very simplistic to say. However, your time is only spent, or misspent, should I say, when you've been inefficient. If you can be efficient with your time at any point in time, then it's a win as far as I'm concerned. So we'll start with the studio owner. Let's look, and this is primarily what our new solution is based around, is optimizing the underutilized time in any given studio. For example, David, we've chatted with many studio owners locally here in Melbourne, but also around Australia, who one case situation was we did a simple math on the underutilized time in a studio here in Melbourne that amounted to the equivalent of $19,500 of underutilized time in any given year. So when we did the maths on that, if we divide it down, that's about, what's my ballpark maths, is like $1,500 a month of underutilized time that could have been captured by that instructor. Now, I don't know about you or many other listeners on the call, but 20 grand or near on 20 grand goes a long way to really changing your bottom line when it comes to a small business or a small operation. So that situation is simply being captured by, let's say, a couple of windows. Maybe a Wednesday afternoon is difficult to fill with instructors and clients. Let's take a Friday afternoon as another common window. Maybe a Saturday afternoon is a window where it could potentially be utilised because the space is looking great. It's just sitting there, tumbleweed going through it during those said times. So by capturing those possibilities of time, David, it's really an exciting window that's essentially capitalising on the asset that it's already sitting there and doing nothing by the way that we're triangulating the three moving parts, being the client, the instructor, and the studio space, with our new software solution called TRIMIO.
TRIMIO. Okay, so there we have it. That's the solution that Bruce has come up with. And Bruce, look, I can verify those sort of figures that you're talking about. Thinking about Pilates Can with our 2 studios in Canberra, we're doing actually 1,000 individual client bookings a month. But between the 2 studios, we could actually double that time. We've looked at the capacity that we've got, and there's some times that are maybe not as traditional that we could use, and others that are really in the sweet spot. And so we can see that we could actually double that. But the problem for us is it's very hard to recruit instructors of the right caliber who can do the right sort of Pilates and that we could have with our clientele and build on the reputation that we have. We've been offering for a contract instructor between $110,000 and $165,000 for a decent full-time effort, depending on how hard the instructor would be wanting to work and how successful they would be in filling those sessions themselves. So I can really understand what you're saying there about the problem and it being a problem worth solving for everyone, for all 3 parties, and having a convenient software solution that could bring everyone together more efficiently and maximize profitability on all 3 sides of the triangle would be fantastic. So that's exciting. It's exciting for the industry if we can pull it off, if you can pull it off. It's obviously a huge project that you've undertaken, and it's well worth us talking about again. So what I'd like to do, we talked earlier in the episode about that time when you had the 3 studios and the lessons that you learnt there, and there's many lessons for Pilates studio owners, Pilates business owners, Pilates instructors that we can walk through in our next discussion. because we're running out of time now. I know you're very busy and you've got other things to do. Thanks very much for the time that you have given us. But in our next episode, let's delve into both of those things, a bit more detail about how TRIMIO actually is going to work or does work and what you're trying to achieve there with that. But we might start back with what was happening with the 3 studios when you were there, Bruce. So thanks very much for your time there, and thanks for your commitment to the industry to want to address these issues and to not just leave the industry hanging, your studios, and then get out and do something else. It's great that we've got people like yourself there at that committee level with the Pilates Alliance of Australasia, at that executive level, and experienced people that know the value of the industry and know that they can contribute and help everyone else that is in the industry, because we all struggle one way or the other at times, and we all need to help each other to work through those.
Sounds fantastic, David. I look forward to that. One thing I wanted to finish on, if that's okay.
Absolutely, go for it.
Basically, the concept is now a solid 4 years old and looking forward to an October 21 launch, which is really, we're on the home straight and there's a lot of things coming together, which is dead exciting to be able to share, like you say, with the industry. Some of the processes we've worked through is really bringing it together into one succinct statement. So I was keen to share that with you just now. And the statement is, David, you know how 85% of Pilates studios have more capacity to fill and 65% of instructors are actively looking for more work? Well, what TRIMIO does is manages the workflow for instructors and studios to engage more easily and to therefore better optimize the use of their space. And in fact, we've helped Melbourne-based studios generate an additional $112,000 of revenue from better utilising their spaces since the launch of our MVP in 2017. So if that's any indication of where things can go in terms of helping businesses be more productive, then I think it's an exciting start.
It certainly is, and I'll look forward to a lot more detail in our next discussion, Bruce, and that will be a pleasure. What I'll also do, Bruce, is obviously include your details, your contact details of how to find you in the show notes, how to find TRIMIO, how to connect with you personally. Bruce, perhaps you could just give a shout out to those 2 locations of where to find yourself and where to find TRIMIO.
The best thing, David, is to jump onto the TRIMIO.app, APP website, and we've got a simple landing page there where you can enter your details and you'll be the first notified when we're on the home straight to releasing, and obviously early stage testing to be rounded out in readiness for our launch in October. So TRIMIO.app is the place to go.
And if people want to connect with you personally, Bruce, what's the best way to do that? Same way, or?
You can jump onto Instagram at bruce.hildebrand. And also at teach.pilates. Those are my 2 handles there on Instagram if you want to check that out.
All right, terrific. Thanks very much, Bruce, for your time and for your dedication to the Pilates industry. And we look forward to that further discussion, and we look forward to hearing more about how you're addressing that issue for us in the industry.
Great, thanks for your time, David, and I'll echo that acknowledgement to you as well, so keep up the great work with the Pilates Business Podcast.
Will do. Thanks very much, Bruce. See you later.
Thanks for listening to the Pilates Business Podcast. Please pay it forward for our Pilates industry by subscribing, or if already subscribed, by sharing this episode with friends now, while you find out what's on next week's episode.
We have some exciting news at the Pilates Business Podcast. We'll be on the Pilates Business Podcast road trip through regional New South Wales over the next few weeks. So stay tuned for some Pilates Bites, short episodes, as well as interviews with Pilates business owners throughout regional New South Wales as we visit their studios and find out what assets they have been building to help and develop their business for the good of Pilates worldwide. Looking forward to that and to seeing you out on the road. Meanwhile, do what you do best and stay awesome.